Okay, let's get into this. We're doing a deep dive today into, well, a really unique and incredibly fierce part of World War I history, the Italian shock troops known as the Arditi.
And that name itself, the Daring Ones, it gives you a pretty strong clue about the kind of soldiers we're discussing here.
Absolutely, because, when you think WWI, the image is often that brutal, static trench warfare, just
hmm
miles of mud, barbed wire, not much movement.
And just immense casualties for, well, tiny gains. It was a real grinding stalemate.
Especially on fronts like the Italian one, where they were up against the Austro-Hungarian army. Breaking through those entrenched lines seemed almost impossible with the usual methods.
Exactly. And that situation, that reality, it created this need for something radically different.
So our mission for this deep dive, and we're guided by a fascinating article from War History Online here, is to really unpack who these Arditi were, what made their whole approach so distinct.
And also what happened to them after the war, because as you said, their story definitely didn't just stop in 1918.
Right. It's a classic case, really, of necessity being the mother of invention, isn't it?
It really is. By 1916, the static nature of the fighting was just starkly obvious. And some, well, forward-thinking young Italian officers, they proposed a pretty radical idea.
Which was?
Basically, create specialized units, volunteers, a vanguard specifically trained and equipped to just blast through enemy defenses.
Instead of the slow, wave after wave infantry assaults we usually picture, this was meant to be more like a surgical strike unit.
Pretty much. Now, the Italian High Command, apparently they were a little hesitant at first, about setting up a completely separate branch.
Okay.
But they did see the value in the concept, the idea of elite volunteers. So they approved the general plan and even gave them a unique distinguishing badge early on.
And interestingly, this wasn't happening in total isolation, right?
Yeah.
The article mentions the other side was thinking along similar lines.
Yeah, the Austro-Hungarians were also looking at assault troop concepts, drawing a bit from German stormtrooper tactics around the same time. Everyone was searching for a way to break the deadlock.
And this Argody idea, it wasn't entirely from scratch either. The source points to some potential earlier routes.
Right, like these explorers back in 1914, apparently doing training behind enemy lines, and also these groups called the Companies of Death.
That sounds pretty dramatic.
It does, doesn't it? They were basically engineering units, but they worked right alongside infantrymen who were kitted out in heavy armor.
Armor. In WWI infantry.
Yeah, specifically for this role. Their job was incredibly dangerous, direct stuff, clearing obstacles like barbed wire, planting explosives, ambushes, basically breaching enemy defenses.
Wow. And the article even mentions their specific Farina helmets and this armor showing up in, video games today. A weird echo.
It is, yeah. So, building on these earlier ideas, when the official Arditi units were formed, the selection was absolutely key.
It wasn't just signing up.
No, strictly volunteers. And not just any volunteers. They were looking for the bravest guys they could find.
But there was also a very practical requirement, wasn't there? Something about noise.
Yes, resilience to artillery noise. They needed soldiers who could function, who could keep their heads with shells exploding right near them.
Which, when you think about it, points directly to how intense their tactics must have been.
Exactly. And these volunteers, they were typically drawn from Italy's existing elite units. You had the Bersaglieri.
Known for their physical strength, courage, that sort of thing.
Right, and the Alpini, the specialist mountain troops.
Right.
Real tough units to begin with.
And you could actually tell where they came from by their uniforms.
Yeah, they had these distinct patches on their lapels with flames. Black flames meant they were from the regular infantry,
Right.
red flames for the Bersaglieri or Arditi, and green flames for the Alpini Arditi. Plus, they had this signature green sweater and a black fez hat. A fez, yeah. And sometimes you'd see them wearing the Bersaglieri cyclist coat, too. It was all about creating this distinct identity, this elite look.
Okay, so they looked the part, but it was their methods, their tactics, that really set them apart. They needed to break that stalemate.
And their core tactic, well, it basically flipped conventional wisdom completely on its head.
Also.
Instead of waiting for their own artillery bombardment to lift entirely, that pause that gave the enemy time to scramble out of cover and get to their machine guns.
Yeah, that crucial, dangerous moment.
The Arditi would charge while the friendly shells were still landing on or very near the target area.
Charging into their own artillery fire. That
Oh.
sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was incredibly dangerous, no question. But the gamble, the strategy, was to hit the enemy trench line in that absolute chaos.
Oh.
while the defenders were still stunned, underground, disorganized.
Before they could properly react.
Exactly. It let the Arditi cross that deadly open ground much faster and hopefully face less organized fire initially.
And once they were actually in the trench, it wasn't about rifles at 50 paces anymore.
No, not at all. Their main thing was intense, skilled, hand-to-hand combat,
Right.
close quarters fighting.
Which brings us to their most notorious weapon.
The dagger. Yeah. They became absolutely synonymous with using the dagger in the tight, brutal confines of trench warfare.
Apparently, they were often encouraged not to even carry their long rifles during the assault itself.
Right. It was all about speed, agility. Daggers and hand grenades were the tools for that environment.
Speaking of grenades, they had a specific preference?
The Felfenot grenade, yeah. Apparently, its actual explosion was, well, pretty weak, according to the source.
So why use it?
The noise, it made an incredibly loud bang. The idea was that the sheer noise added to the panic and confusion among defenders already reeling from the artillery.
Clever in a brutal way. And they had other tools too, right? For bunkers and things.
Mm-hmm. Flamethrowers. And small caliber infantry cannons they could bring up to deal with machine gun nests, pillboxes, that sort of hard target.
Okay, so this focus on daggers, on hand-to-hand. How did they get so good at it? This wasn't standard infantry training.
No, and this is one of those really fascinating details from the source. Their close combat training, it actually drew on methods from get this, a late 14th century fencing and martial arts manual.
14th century. Seriously.
Seriously. The Flower of Battle by a master named Fiore de' Liberi. They were essentially reviving and adapting centuries-old Italian martial arts techniques for the trenches.
Wow. So it wasn't just about being tough. It was actual historical technique.
Exactly. It gave them a specific practical edge in that close quarters environment, a direct link to the past, helping them in modern warfare.
Incredible. But that effectiveness, it clearly came at a huge cost. And their mindset, well, their motto kind of says it all.
We either win or we all die. Yeah, that sums it up pretty starkly.
And it wasn't just talk, was it? The source calls their missions suicide charges.
Pretty much. The risk level was just astronomical. The casualty rates are, well, they're staggering to think about.
So what kind of numbers are we talking?
Between 25% and 30% casualties on each mission.
25 to 30%.
Yeah.
Every single time they went over the top.
That's what the source indicates. Just think about that. The bravery, or perhaps desperation, required.
The article gives a specific, brutal example too, Montes Valdo.
Yeah, April 1916. An entire attacking unit, 13 officers, 400 soldiers, completely wiped out, just gone.
A total loss. It's hard to comprehend.
It is. And yet, despite that horrific cost, the overall assessment reported in the source was that their success rate was, quote, favorable.
So they often achieved their objectives, but the price was just incredibly consistently high.
That seems to be the picture. And because they were effective despite the cost, their numbers actually grew quite a bit.
How many were there eventually?
By 1917, around 18,000 Arditi. They even set up a dedicated training facility that year at Stricca di Manzano in Friuli.
And by the war's end?
They'd expanded to 25 assault units, enough to form their own division of shock troopers.
There was also that specialized group, the Caimans.
Ah, yeah, the Caimans of the Piave, a great example of them adapting their skills. They operated along the Piave River.
And their method was pretty wild, right?
Totally. Swimming silently across the river at night. Holding their daggers, the source mentions a specific type, a Sardinian folding knife called a risolza, in their teeth.
Dagger in teeth, swimming across a river at night to raid enemy positions. That's movie stuff.
Pretty much sums up the Arditi spirit, though. Daring, adaptable, maybe a little crazy.
And their overall impact on the war effort, was it significant?
Absolutely. The source credits them with playing a really crucial role in the final breakthrough on the Piave River in November 1918.
Which was key to defeating the Austro-Hungarians.
Yes, that offensive led directly to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian armies on the Italian front. The Arditi were instrumental in that victory.
So this incredibly effective, incredibly costly elite force was vital to Italy winning the war. But, like you said earlier, the story doesn't end neatly with the armistice in 1918. What happened next?
Well, officially, the Arditi units were disbanded in 1920.
Okay, end of story.
Not quite. The veterans, the Arditi identity, this whole ethos, it remained a really powerful and volatile force in Italian politics during a very turbulent post-war period.
And this is where things get complicated. The source mentions their involvement in Fiume.
Right. Many Arditi veterans took part in the illegal occupation of the city of Fiume, which is Rijeka in Croatia now, back in 1919.
Led by Gabriele D'Annunzio, the poet.
That's the one, the nationalist, poet, and war hero figure. And it's really notable that the Arditi involved in occupying Fiume, they actually proclaimed D'Annunzio their deuce.
Deuce. Wow, that title would obviously take on a much bigger, darker meaning very soon after.
Exactly. And the connection, or at least the appropriation of their image by rising political movements, gets even clearer.
How so?
When Benito Mussolini was forming his fascist militia, the Black Shirts,
Yeah.
he explicitly modeled their look, their black shirts, and their general paramilitary style on the Arditi. He was deliberately trying to co-opt that image of bravery, of nationalistic fervor, of elite force.
Trying to associate his movement with their wartime prestige.
Precisely. But, and this is crucial, the story isn't just a straight line from Arditi heroism to fascism. There was a pushback from within the Arditi ranks themselves.
You mean the Arditi del Popolo?
Exactly. The People's Arditi. This was a significant faction formed mostly by former Arditi servicemen who took a strong anti-fascist stance.
So Arditi versus Arditi, in a way, or at least Arditi versus those adopting their image.
Kind of. They formed their own paramilitary group specifically to fight back against Mussolini's growing black shirt movement on the streets.
And they actually fought.
Oh, yes. The source highlights a famous standoff in Parma in 1922. About 350 Arditi del Popolo members went up against literally thousands, over 10,000 black shirts and their supporters in street fighting.
350 versus 10,000. What happened?
Remarkably, the Arditi del Popolo, using their combat skills, actually defeated the fascist forces in Parma. They drove them out of the city in that particular confrontation.
That's incredible. A major moment of resistance.
It really was an act of defiance, using those very Arditi skills against the movement trying to steal their legacy. But
It didn't last.
no. Tragically, the source notes that after Mussolini seized power later that year, the members of the Arditi del Popolo were systematically hunted down, arrested, imprisoned.
Right.
Most were executed. That anti-fascist branch was brutally suppressed.
A really dark end to that part of the story. Yet, the core idea of the Arditi as elite troops, it didn't totally vanish.
No, despite that complex and often grim post-war history, the legacy of the Arditi as elite shock troops, that idea persists. It's noted that their tradition continues within Italian special forces units even today.
So we're wrapping this up. What's the big picture here? We've got this unit, born from the sheer desperation of WWI trench warfare.
Defined by incredible daring, unique hand-to-hand tactics, specific weapons like the dagger, and just a willingness to accept unbelievably high casualties.
They were undeniably effective, crucial to Italy's victory in the war.
Absolutely. But then, after the fighting stopped, their potent identity, their veterans, their whole image became deeply entangled in Italy's intense political struggles.
Contributing, ironically, both to the rise of fascism through imitation.
And also providing perhaps the most significant armed resistance against it from within their own ranks.
It's a legacy filled with battlefield heroism, but also deeply complicated by political conflict, participation, and ultimately suppression.
Which leaves us with a really interesting question, something for you, the listener, to think about. What does the story of the Arditi really tell us about the nature of these elite military units?
Forged in the heat of battle.
Yeah, forged in that intense crucible of war. How can the very skills, the courage, the strong identity that makes them so effective on the battlefield manifest in such complex, unpredictable, and sometimes deeply political ways once the war is over and peace returns?